still goes around calling us quite a new group, you know, sort of. And I don't know, honestly. I think we sort of pretty well set up for at least another year.
For decades, fans believed Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan shared a mutual respect as two giants who defined an era. But behind the curtain of rock and roll glamour, the truth is far darker. Jagger, proud, charismatic, and the unstoppable frontman of the Rolling Stones, saw Dylan as more than a peer. He saw him as a rival, a disruptor, and at times even a threat to his legacy. What began as admiration soon turned into bitterness, with Jagger reportedly mocking Dylan's voice, dismissing his lyrics, and resenting the way critics placed Dylan on a higher pedestal. Their feud was not just about music. It was about ego, identity, and who would be remembered as the true voice of their generation. And as shocking stories from bandmates, friends, and even Jagger himself have surfaced, one thing has become clear. No one seemed to ignite Jagger's jealousy and contempt more than Bob Dylan. When the Rolling Stones exploded onto the scene in the 1960s, Mick Jagger quickly became the face of swaggering rock and roll. But as much as Jagger dominated the stage, there was another figure reshaping music in an entirely different way: Bob Dylan. Unlike Jagger's blues-driven bravado, Dylan was wielding words like weapons, writing songs that weren't just hits, but cultural revolutions. For fans, the two men seemed like complementary forces. Jagger with his electrifying performances, Dylan with his poetic genius. Yet behind the scenes, tension was brewing. From the start, Dylan often appeared dismissive of the Stones, once saying their music felt like a bubblegum version of the blues. For a man as fiercely protective of his band's reputation as Jagger, those words cut deep. Jagger saw Dylan not only as competition, but as someone whose influence could overshadow his own achievements. What made it sting even more was the critics. They praised Dylan as a prophet, a voice of a generation, while Jagger was often framed as merely the entertainer, the showman, not the visionary. This comparison planted the seed of bitterness. By the late 60s, things escalated. Jagger began openly mocking Dylan's voice in interviews, joking about his nasal tone and rambling lyrics. To Jagger, Dylan wasn't untouchable. He was overrated. Meanwhile, Dylan retaliated in subtle ways, dismissing rock frontmen as actors playing characters on stage. And when Dylan turned electric at Newport in 1965, stepping into rock territory, Jagger saw it as a direct invasion of his turf. Their relationship was no longer built on admiration. It was a rivalry sharpened by envy, insecurity, and a battle for cultural dominance. As the 1970s dawned, Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan had both become towering figures in popular culture. Yet instead of bonding as icons of their generation, the rivalry only deepened. What made this feud so fascinating was that it rarely boiled over into direct confrontations. Instead, it played out in interviews, subtle digs, and even their music. Jagger, known for his sharp tongue, rarely missed an opportunity to undercut Dylan when reporters brought him up. When asked about Dylan's songwriting, Jagger once quipped that Dylan was a poet first, a performer second, with a smirk that suggested the Rolling Stones frontman didn't think Dylan belonged on the same stage as true rockers. He often mocked Dylan's famously nasal singing voice, joking that it sounded like someone strangling a cat. To fans, it might have seemed like harmless teasing, but those close to Jagger knew it came from a place of resentment. Dylan, on the other hand, had his own way of firing back. While he was less flamboyant in interviews, his disdain for Jagger seeped through in his comments about rock stardom. Dylan once dismissed bands like the Stones as circus acts, claiming their focus was on theatrics rather than substance. For Jagger, whose entire career was built on commanding the stage with charisma and energy, this was an insult that hit home. The tension wasn't just verbal. It also showed up when they crossed paths socially. At parties and industry events, witnesses recalled a chilly distance between the two. Dylan was notoriously aloof, often surrounding himself with intellectuals, poets, and folk purists, while Jagger thrived in the glamorous, hedonistic world of rock. Their personalities clashed just as much as their art. Jagger saw Dylan as pretentious, hiding behind riddles and metaphors, while Dylan viewed Jagger as shallow, a man more concerned with fame and women than with artistry. But the rivalry took on another dimension when critics got involved. During the Stones' tours in the early 70s, many writers compared their lyrics unfavorably to Dylan's catalog. Jagger, despite his countless hits, was still being measured against Dylan's masterpieces like Blowin' in the Wind and like a Rolling Stone. The implication was clear. Dylan was the poet laureate of rock, while Jagger was merely its performer. Jagger hated this narrative, and his bitterness often spilled into his public comments. Perhaps the most infamous incident came when Dylan was asked to appear at the Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus TV special in 1968. Though he declined, Dylan later quipped that the Stones seemed desperate to prove themselves. To Jagger, this was yet another backhanded swipe, a reminder that Dylan didn't see the Stones as equals, but as entertainers trying to reach his level of cultural gravitas. By the mid-70s, the feud had become almost legendary in music circles. Other musicians were often forced to pick sides, and while some admired Dylan's lyricism, many respected Jagger's ability to keep the Stones relevant year after year. The irony, of course, was that both men were insecure in their own ways. Dylan about his ability to sustain relevance in the rock world, and Jagger about being taken seriously as more than a showman. Their rivalry wasn't just about each other. It was about what they represented, two clashing visions of what it meant to be the voice of a generation. By the 1980s, both Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan were cemented as legends, but their rivalry was far from fading. In fact, this era saw their tension peak as the changing music industry placed them under new scrutiny. Jagger was pushing the Rolling Stones into stadium-sized spectacles, while Dylan was experimenting with shifting sounds. From gospel-inspired records to politically charged anthems, the contrast couldn't have been sharper, and their occasional encounters only added fuel to the fire. One notable flashpoint came when Jagger ventured into a solo career in the mid-1980s. Critics immediately drew comparisons, not to other rock frontmen, but to Dylan. When Dylan released Infidels in 1983, it was praised for its lyrical sharpness, while Jagger's solo efforts were criticized as shallow and overproduced. The media narrative painted Dylan as still artistically relevant, while Jagger seemed to be cashing in on fame. For a man as image-conscious as Jagger, these comparisons were infuriating. The tension spilled into interviews. Jagger, asked about Dylan's career in 1985, gave a backhanded compliment. "Bob's great at being Bob Dylan, but I'm not sure anyone wants to see him dance." It was a jab at Dylan's lack of stage charisma, a way for Jagger to assert his dominance as the ultimate performer. Dylan, never one to let things slide, retaliated in subtle but cutting ways. When asked about rock stars going solo, Dylan quipped, "Some people mistake fame for freedom. They think they can buy it, but you can't." Many took this as a veiled shot at Jagger's solo ambitions. But the rivalry wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Jagger represented the glamorous, commercial side of rock, while Dylan was seen as its uncompromising conscience. When Live Aid brought the biggest names in music together in 1985, the contrast was on full display. Jagger took the stage with Tina Turner in a flashy, high-energy performance that thrilled audiences, while Dylan appeared later with Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood, delivering a stripped-down, rough-edged set. Though they shared the same stage, their approaches to music and fame couldn't have been more different. Behind the scenes, musicians close to both stars described an ongoing Cold War. Keith Richards, Jagger's longtime bandmate, was reportedly more sympathetic to Dylan, even collaborating with him at times. This only deepened Jagger's irritation, as he felt Dylan was intruding on the Stones' circle. Meanwhile, Dylan rarely praised Jagger publicly, once remarking in an interview that the Stones' newer work sounded like a funk band trying to play rock and roll. To Jagger, who prided himself on keeping the Stones' sound fresh, this was an unforgivable insult. By the late 1980s, the rivalry had reached a strange equilibrium. They couldn't ignore each other. Journalists constantly asked about it, but they also couldn't reconcile. The truth was, they needed each other as foils. Dylan's mystique made Jagger's showmanship look excessive, while Jagger's star power made Dylan's aloofness look all the more deliberate. They were opposites locked in a dance neither could step away from. And as the music world shifted into the MTV era, with younger artists dominating the charts, both men seemed increasingly aware that their feud was part of their shared legacy. For fans, it was both entertaining and baffling. How could two of the greatest artists of the 20th century, who had shaped music in such profound ways, carry such disdain for each other? The answer lay not just in personality, but in pride. Both Jagger and Dylan wanted to be remembered as the voice of their generation, and there was only room for one at the top. As time passed and both men entered their later years, the rivalry between Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan softened, though it never truly disappeared. By the 1990s and 2000s, they were no longer competing for radio dominance or magazine covers, but their reputations remained deeply intertwined. Each was a living legend, and each still carried the scars of decades of comparison. In many ways, age brought perspective. Dylan, having survived countless reinventions, continued to tour relentlessly, playing small theaters and arenas with his trademark unpredictability. Jagger, meanwhile, was still leading the Rolling Stones in record-breaking stadium tours, proving that his charisma hadn't dimmed with age. Yet despite their parallel success, Jagger's private comments about Dylan remained sharp. In one interview, he described Dylan's shows as a man refusing to rehearse, mocking Dylan's tendency to reinvent songs until they were almost unrecognizable. But Dylan wasn't one to take the high road either. He once described Jagger as a great rock and roll dancer, pointedly leaving out any mention of songwriting or artistry. To Dylan, Jagger remained the ultimate performer, but not an equal in depth. These backhanded remarks reflected an old tension that never quite healed. Even when they appeared at the same events, like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremonies, their interactions were brief, polite, and tinged with the weight of history. Interestingly, younger generations began to interpret their rivalry differently. To fans in the 2000s and beyond, Dylan and Jagger weren't just competitors, they were complementary forces. Dylan embodied the uncompromising poet, while Jagger represented the magnetic entertainer. Together, they painted a complete picture of what rock and roll could be. Yet for Jagger himself, the old insecurities still lingered. He hated the idea of being remembered as style without substance, especially when critics continually placed Dylan's lyrics among the greatest. In modern history, the most poignant moments of their later years came not in words, but in silence. At times, Dylan would cover Rolling Stones songs in his live shows, though in his own stripped-down style. It was an acknowledgement of Jagger's enduring influence, though Dylan never admitted admiration outright. Jagger, on the other hand, rarely covered Dylan, but sometimes spoke of him with a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. When asked in a 2010 interview whether Dylan had influenced him, Jagger shrugged. "We were all influenced by everyone. Bob was just part of the mix." It was the closest he came to admitting Dylan's importance. By their 70s, both men had outlasted nearly all of their peers, proving themselves as survivors in an industry that often chewed up and discarded its icons. Yet their relationship remained one of unfinished business. Two giants who, despite walking the same path, could never quite walk side by side. What made the rivalry so enduring wasn't just their differences, but the way each reflected the other's greatest fears. Dylan feared irrelevance, while Jagger feared superficiality, and in each other they saw those fears brought to life. Today, when music historians look back, they see not just a feud, but a story of two men who shaped, and sometimes resented, the cultural weight placed upon them. Mick Jagger may have truly hated Bob Dylan more than anyone, but that hatred was rooted in envy, admiration, and the eternal question of legacy. Who would history remember as the true voice of their generation? Perhaps the answer is both, or perhaps, as Jagger might secretly fear, Dylan will always have the last word.